And I take this opportunity to welcome all the speakers and participants to this webinar that is being hosted by Wipro Foundation. This is part of a series of webinars and other initiatives that we at Wipro Foundation facilitate for our partners as part of the process of sharing best practices, peer learning initiatives, and capacity building efforts. So today's webinar is titled Towards Inclusive Learning, and our eminent panelists will be speaking on issues surrounding inclusion that need to be brought to the forefront of our discussions on learning and education needs of our children. So the session will be anchored by Archana Mehendale. She's an independent researcher and works in the areas of education law and policy, regulation and inclusive education. She's currently an adjunct honorary professor at the Center for Excellence in Teacher Education at TIS Mumbai. Our other panelists, I'm sure we'll know more about them and their work through the session, but quickly to introduce all of them, we've got B Ramdas, who's been working for nearly 3 decades in Gudalur block of Nilgiris with the tribal communities and the Adivasi children there. We've got Brajesh and Savita from Muskaan, which is an organization that's based in Bhopal. They are part of a team that oversee curriculum development and publication. They've also taught for several years. We've got Chitra Shah, who is the founder director of Satya Special School, which is based out of Puducherry. And we've got Jo Chopra-McGowan, who is the founder of executive director of Latika Roy Foundation, and she's also got close to 3 decades of experience on disability services, rights and awareness. So welcome all the panelists again. We look forward to all the discussions. I request all of you to keep the video on, request all other participants to keep themselves on mute to facilitate the discussions. And the chat box will be disabled. Please put in your questions in the Q&A box. We'll collate it and share it with the panelists at a later time. So Archana, thank you once again. It's over to you.
Thank you very much, Supriya, as well as the Wipro Foundation for inviting me here today to moderate this session and also to listen in to some of the most experienced people in this field of inclusive education today. But before I hand over and start posing some of the questions that have bothered me for a long time about inclusive education, I just wanted to give a few opening remarks. We know in recent times there is a growing recognition to the need to build inclusive education systems wherein we want each individual to have equal opportunity for educational progress. We also see that there is a recognition that we need to build systems that are designed to be not only inclusive as we know it, but also equitable and empowering so that they can help build inclusive societies. And this is reflected, we find, in the way the NEP 2020 talks about education as being the most important tool for achieving social justice and equality, and hence should aim to benefit all of India's children so that no child loses any opportunity to learn and excel because of the circumstances of birth or background. But what is the idea of inclusive education, and does it refer only to education of children with disabilities? So in 1994, the Salamanca Statement and Framework for Action provided a very simple and elegant guiding principle, which I think was a landmark in our understanding of inclusion. And it said that schools should accommodate all children, regardless of their physical, intellectual, social, emotional, linguistic, or other conditions. And in fact, schools have to find ways of successfully educating all children, including those who have serious disadvantages and disabilities. And it recognizes that human differences, as we all know, are normal, and that learning must be adapted to the needs of the child rather than the child fitted into preordained assumptions regarding what pace of learning they should follow or what kind of learning process should be delivered. So in other words, instead of having the child adjust and fit in, the schools have to respond to the diverse learning needs and accommodate differences of learning styles, pace of learning, appropriate curricula, have teaching strategies, and in fact offer a continuum of support to the children. So today's panelists will bring with them some of the rich insights that they have gained based on their long experience of extended this kind of inclusive education idea into some solid practice on the ground. So let me get straight to them and start by asking the first question, which I think is the core of our understanding of inclusion, and that is, what does inclusive education actually involve? And if we talk about inclusive schools, what do inclusive schools look like? And based on their experiences, if they could also please share what benefits they have seen all children deriving out of learning together. And I would like to start by inviting Jo.
Okay, thank you very much. So when I think about an inclusive school, I think of a school that works for everybody, a school that promotes cooperation rather than competition. If you look at most of the schools that our kids go to today, there is this fierce desire to be the top of the class, to be at least in the top 10. You may be competing with the other kids in the class, or even with your own parents. How did they do when they went to school? You have to at least achieve as much as they did. And the vibe that creates in a classroom or in a school is not learning for its own sake, learning to understand things, but it's learning to perform for an exam, to do better than everybody else. And so a kind of atmosphere gets created where you're not sharing, you're not collaborating with your classmates, you are actually trying to outdo them. And so this competitive atmosphere is anathema to a truly inclusive environment where everybody should be welcome. So the first thing is that it works for everyone and it promotes cooperation rather than competition, which is really what we need if we're going to get along in this world. And the third thing is that it recognizes that all children are hardwired to learn. And a good teacher gives every child in her classroom the benefit of the doubt. So if there's some problem, if a child is not learning, the teacher tries to figure out what's going on, what is getting in that child's way, and makes that problem disappear as much as possible. We can't solve every problem, but every child wants to learn. That's what they're there for. They are not trying to be difficult. They're not lazy. They're not avoiding the work. They really came to school because they want to learn. And so the teacher's job is to try and make it happen. Inclusion is not a laundry list. It's not like a menu or a bill of rights in which all the different conditions, 21 disabilities, 40% or more. If you're on the list, you're in the school. If you're not, you're not. That's not what it is. Inclusion is an attitude. It's a welcoming. It's an attitude that says, however you come into this classroom, you're welcome here. And we're going to make it work for you. I'll just give one quick story, which to me typifies what inclusive education makes possible. We run an inclusive program, an after-school program at Latika Roy Foundation called Latika Vihar. It's a club where kids come and have fun. And there's this one little girl that I know very well because she lives in my own house. Her name is Lakshi, and she grew up in my house. So she knew my daughter Moy Moy very well. Moy Moy had severe disabilities, and Lakshi grew up in Moy's presence. And then she went to our inclusive center from the time that she was 3. And so she grew up with all kinds of people, and she began to understand that people are all different, and that's what makes them interesting. One day I was walking home from Latika Vihar with Lakshi, and we were talking about her brother, and her brother's best friend was a boy named Ajay. And we're walking by what I knew to be Ajay's house, and I saw a little girl whose name was Shreya in the driveway. And Lakshi said, "Hi, Ajay." And as we went by, I said, "Lakshi, that was Shreya. I thought Ajay was a boy." And she said, "To all the world, Shreya is a girl. But we know that Shreya is actually Ajay, and Ajay is a boy." Now, I was quite stunned by this. This kid may be a trans child and presenting as looking like a girl, but feeling like a boy. Lakshmi had no problem with that. She just said, that's how it is. That's Ajay. That's not Shreya. Everybody else thinks it's Shreya, but it's actually Ajay. So to me, this is what inclusion makes possible, that we can begin to accept people as they present. And that is really what we need in a place where we are riven by divisions of all kinds based on religion, caste, and color, and income. We need the promise that inclusive education brings us. Thanks.
Thanks, Jo. I think this question of identity being divisive in the process of learning, I think that's something that we really need to look at more seriously. I want to now invite Ramdas, who has in fact worked for a number of years with Adivasis. Ramdas?
Yeah, thank you. Nice to be part of this group. I want to start where, in fact, Jo left off. So this question of inclusiveness or inclusion, it's not a program that you take on. It's a culture. See, you either have it or you don't have it. There's no midway in that. You know, I just want to mention something that happened very early in my career, which sort of shook me and made me look at things very differently. I was assigned to do an evaluation of a community health project in a rural village in Tamil Nadu. When I went there, I found that it was actually a leprosy hospital. And the very senior doctor who was working over there, obviously he had no help. Nobody wants to come and work in the hospital. So it was difficult to even catch him to have a meeting. Finally, one evening I caught him. And then he said, yeah, come to the office. And then he comes there, the door is locked. He calls his assistant. The assistant comes, and with completely deformed man, with great difficulty, he's trying to take out the keys from his bag because there are no fingers there, you see. And gives it to the doctor. Doctor is opening the door. And I start to ask the doctor, how can you live with these people? You know, I haven't even finished my question. This doctor, he didn't bat an eyelid, he didn't say a word. He simply swiveled around, caught this man, gave him a hug, swiveled back, opened the door, and just went in as though this is the most normal thing to do in the world. Now, this was a very, very transformative thing, because here you have set the standard, you have set the attitude, you have said how the institution is going to be, you know. So you can't go to your school, you know, in the morning assembly and then say, okay, teachers, from 10 o'clock to 1 o'clock, we will all be inclusive. It's not a program like that. It's not something you do 1 hour or 1 day or 1 week. You either have it or you don't have it. So it has to be something that permeates every aspect of a school. It can't be partial. You know, for me, the school is a very sacred space. It's a very non-discriminatory space. And as Archana, you mentioned in your article also, this question of equal opportunity. See, once we bring in this question of equality, you know, or you mentioned at the end, equity. You know, that's a very, very loaded term. It talks about social justice. So the school is a space which is really a microcosm of the kind of society that we want in the future. And are we creating that space there? This is really my question. So in our school, of course, the school has been run by Adivasi community. It is part of the Sangam school. So the majority of the children are Adivasi children, but our children study there. A lot of other children who are not Adivasis also study in the school. But the basic culture of the school is Adivasi. So the songs, the history that we teach is the history of the Adivasi community over there. The songs we sing, but doesn't stop with that, you see, because we have children from other languages or religions, we have other communities. So everything is celebrated there, you know. So the celebration of life is a very important part of this whole thing. So the diversity of life and the celebration of life, I think this is very, very important for all of us. So we don't stop with just doing one kind of thing. You know? I'll just stop there for now and leave you to, we'll go on to others.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Ramdas. I think it's very important to remind this idea of inclusion not being just a program or a scheme, which has traditionally been the way the government has looked at addressing the needs of different special groups. In fact, all these groups are seen in silos and only from the lens of a program being delivered to each of them separately. So to look at this as almost a way of life and something that starts with in terms of what happens every day in the school or even in the communities. I think that's a very powerful message. I now want to invite Chitra to respond. She works in a special school in Pondicherry, and very often special is seen as exclusive. So Chitra, how do you look at this idea of inclusive education?
Thank you all. And going by what Jo and Mr. Ramdas said, initially, like every time I would talk to people about inclusion, the conversation would stop with enrollment. They'll say, oh, we don't mind, our schools are open, please do come. You can, come and enroll your children. But what after that? So inclusion for us was creating an enabling environment where you don't differentiate them on what they can do or cannot do. So when we were actually having this conversation with the government, we realized that it is not just children with special needs who are not accepted. There are also other marginalized groups like children of commercial sex workers, children from juvenile delinquents, children of prisoners, and also children from the other marginalized tribal groups like Mr. Ramdas is working. So what we decided at Satya was that we created a separate entity for this excluded population. And it was called the Alternative Inclusive Center for Education. Two things were different. One, we never went by what the child can or cannot do. It was completely ability based. You could be in standard 1, but you could actually be 8 years old. It was not an age specific curriculum, but it was an ability specific curriculum. The government said, why are you creating something parallel? But we had to show to them that inclusion is not something that, you take this child and put them in the school, in a classroom where the others don't even understand this child, or sometimes they don't even see what this child is capable of doing, and just label them by probably their physical appearance or by what they've heard about their family background and about their situations, but rather a space where the children can grow together. So when we first brought these two groups, diverse groups, even my own mothers were a little concerned about, oh, what's going to happen if my child talks to a drug peddler? Would they be picking up these habits? How will they, kind of manage with the commercial sex worker's daughter? And I remember this day when we just opened up the doors for both the groups. And I think in about a few seconds, nobody saw differences there. It didn't matter to any of the other children if our kids were on a wheelchair or our kids could communicate. And to our kids, their background actually didn't matter. So sometimes I think that, this differentiations happen only with the adults, The children are generally overwhelmingly accepting everybody. And if we can just create an opportunity for these two groups to come together, which is accessible, where attitudes are changed. So I only go by these 3 A's: accessibility, acceptance, and attitude. If we can work on this, I think inclusion can happen, but we need to give them that opportunity. And that's what we are trying to do. I'll probably stop here and then maybe talk about it later.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Chitra. I think my own experience of having spoken to several adults, persons with disabilities, has been that they've always found that that sense of alienation and isolation begins at the level of the school itself. So this whole process of bringing all children in school together, where they are actually not aware of some of these differences at all, and there is a more organic and natural process of growing and learning together, I think is very critical for I think building inclusive societies, if we may put it that way. We'll come back to some of how that process was in a bit, Chitra. I now actually want to invite Brajesh Verma and of course his colleague Savita Sohit. They work with Muskaan, and Muskaan has worked with actually street and working children, a very I would say a neglected group from the point of view of education, where they are on the periphery. They're not even seen as part of the education system. So Brajesh, what do you think inclusive education involves? How does it look like?
Yeah. तो मैम हम अपने जो बच्चों के साथ, जैसा आपने बताया, हम एक मार्जिनलाइज सेक्शन के साथ काम कर रहे हैं और एक स्कूल रन कर रहे हैं। तो हमें जो समझ में आता है और जो इंक्लूजन का मसला है कि दरअसल जो सभी पैनलिस्ट बोल रहे हैं वो एक बहुत संवेदनशील मसले हैं कि यदि हम बच्चों के डिसेबिलिटी की बात करें या एक जेंडर कास्ट क्लास के आधार पर डिस्क्रिमिनेशन की बात करें, लेकिन हम देखते हैं कि हमारा सोसाइटी भी एक तरह से बहुत डिफरेंशिएट दिखता है कि एक अलग अलग वर्ग वहां दिखाई देते हैं। और मुझे लगता है कि जो स्कूल्स हैं वो स्कूल्स उसमें एक बड़ा रोल प्ले करते हैं, क्योंकि हमारे सोसाइटी में एक बहुत अलग अलग तरह का स्कूलिंग हमें देखने को मिलता है। एक खास वर्ग के लिए खास तरह का स्कूल आपको दिखेगा। 500 रुपीज 50 रुपीज से लेकर 5000 10,000 की फी करने वाले स्कूल आपको दिखेंगे, और वहां पर से जो वर्ग निकलता है वो अपनी एक अलग लाइफ में चल रहे होते हैं। तो वहाँ हमें एक तरह का इंक्लूजन नहीं दिखाई देता है कि एक खास वर्ग, अगर पारधी क्लास समूह का बच्चा है और वो हमारे किसी बड़े अधिकारी के बच्चे के साथ उसका एक कन्वर्सेशन हो रहा हो, ऐसे स्पेसेस सोसाइटी में है नहीं, और स्कूल भी वो प्लेस प्रोवाइड नहीं कराते हैं। और जब ये सिचुएशन हम देखते हैं तो स्कूल के बाद जब वो सोसाइटी में बच्चा रिस्पॉन्ड कर रहा होता है या सोसाइटी में अपना रोल प्ले कर रहा होता है, तो वो हमें सोसाइटी में भी दिखाई देता है कि एक खास वर्ग की एक्सेप्टेंस हमें सोसाइटी के अलग समय अलग जगहों पर नहीं दिखाई देती है। तो स्कूल में अगर हर वर्ग के बच्चे, चाहे वो पारधी हो, चाहे वो गोंड हो, चाहे खंडर हो, या वो सवर्ण समुदाय के जो मेन स्ट्रीम या इस वर्ग के अगर बच्चों का एक कॉमन स्पेस बनता है जहाँ पर वो एक दूसरे की लर्निंग्स को एक दूसरे से लर्न कर सकें, एक दूसरे की लर्निंग्स को शेयर कर सकें, एक दूसरे के एक्सपीरियंसेस को शेयर कर सकें, तो शायद एक बेहतर सोसाइटी की तरफ भी हम जा रहे होंगे। और इंटर ग्रुप्स, इंटर रिलीजन्स, इंटर कास्ट हमें अलग अलग एक्सपीरियंसेस सुनने को मिलेंगे, और शायद एक बेहतर सोसाइटी की तरफ, जिसके हम सभी लोग कल्पना करते हैं कि शिक्षा का उद्देश्य है एक बेहतर समाज का निर्माण करना। लेकिन अगर वो एक कॉमन प्लेटफॉर्म पर लोग नहीं आ रहे होंगे, जहाँ पर लोग एक दूसरे को जान नहीं रहे होंगे, तो शायद सोसाइटी में भी वो विभेद हमें दिखाई देता है। तो शायद तो मेरा और संस्थागत हम लोग का ये अनुभव है कि स्कूलों को इस तरह से, स्कूल में वो स्पेस होना चाहिए जहाँ, या स्कूल को ऐसा बिल्ड किया जाना चाहिए जहाँ हर वर्ग के बच्चे का एक्सेस हो और वो एक साथ मिलकर सीख रहे हो। शायद ये बात अपनी रखना चाह रहा था।
थैंक यू ब्रजेश जी। एक्चुअली जो हम कई बार देखते हैं, और ये पहले भी रामदास जी ने बताया कि जो स्ट्रैटिफिकेशन हो रहा है स्कूलों में, वो एक आईना है स्ट्रैटिफाइड सोसाइटी का। तो इसीलिए हमको मूल रूप से स्कूल किस तरीके से प्लान किए गए हैं, ऑर्गेनाइज किए गए हैं, उस पर थोड़ा ध्यान देना पड़ेगा। और जब हम कह रहे हैं इंक्लूसिव स्कूल्स, तो ये कॉमन स्कूल सिस्टम की आइडिया भी जो कोठारी कमीशन रिपोर्ट के साथ से हमारे पॉलिसी डिस्कोर्स में बनी रही है, लेकिन उस पर कुछ अमल नहीं हो पा रहा है। तो इंक्लूसिव एजुकेशन, लर्निंग टुगेदर, सोशल जस्टिस, ये हमारे नीति में, धोरण में काफी हद तक कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल वैल्यूज भी वही उसके ही आधार पर बनी हुई है। तो फिर भी लेकिन हम उस पर कुछ कर नहीं पा रहे हैं। तो मेरा एक्चुअली दूसरा सवाल है, और शायद आप ही से मैं शुरू कर सकती हूँ ये सवाल, कि इंक्लूसिव स्कूल्स बनाने के लिए क्या करना पड़ता है? व्हाट डज इट एक्चुअली टेक टू मेक स्कूल्स इंक्लूसिव? और आपके अनुभव के आधार पर अगर आप कोई भी जो चैलेंजेस आपको आई हुई हो उसके बारे में भी बता सकते हैं तो अच्छा होगा, क्योंकि फिर हम देख सकते हैं कि ये जो प्रयत्न रहा है स्कूलों को इंक्लूसिव बनाने का, वो किस तरीके से दिखता है, उसमें क्या हो सकता है। क्योंकि कई सारे पार्टिसिपेंट्स हमारे वेबिनार में ऐसे होंगे जो ये आइडिया से बिल्कुल सहमत हो गए। ये कई लोगों के एक सपना होता है कि ऐसी स्कूल बने जो सबके लिए हो। तो सरकारी धोरण भी इस तरीके का है, लेकिन किस तरीके से बनाया जा सकता है उस पर अगर आप कुछ प्रकाश डालें तो अच्छा होगा। ब्रजेश जी, विल स्टार्ट विथ यू फर्स्ट।
जरूर। तो हम लोग जो अपने प्रैक्टिसेस हैं हमारे स्कूल, हम एक स्कूल चला रहे हैं जो खासकर मार्जिनलाइज सेक्शन के बच्चों के लिए है, जो फर्स्ट क्लास टू 8th क्लास है। और यहाँ हम जो कोशिश कर रहे हैं, जो हमारे प्रयास हैं, वो मैं आपके साथ अपने साथियों के साथ शेयर करना चाहता हूँ। कि एक तो ये होता है कि आपको स्कूल का स्पेस बच्चे के लिए हमेशा एक स्पेस ऐसा बने जहाँ पर बच्चा अपने आप वो जगह को अपना जगह मान रहा हो कि ये जगह मेरी है, जहाँ पर मैं आ सकता हूँ और ये जगह मुझे सीखने के लिए जगह दे रही है। दरअसल जो मैम शुरू में बोली कि अनुभव ये है कि जब बच्चे को जहाँ सीखने को मिलता है, वो जगह पे बच्चा ज़रूर जा रहा होता है। जिन बच्चों के साथ हम काम कर रहे हैं, वो सुबह 3 घंटे काम करने के बाद 9 बजे के बाद स्कूल पढ़ने के लिए आ रहे होते हैं, क्योंकि शायद उन्हें लगता है कि यहाँ कुछ चीज़ें ऐसी हैं, जो उन्हें सीखने के लिए मिल रही हैं। तो सबसे ज़रूरी चीज़ है कि अगर बच्चे को कुछ भी जिस स्तर पर वो खड़ा है, उससे अगले स्तर पर लेके जाने की एफर्ट्स हो रहे हो, तो बच्चे के लिए स्कूल आने के लिए बहुत एफर्ट्स कर रहा होता है। दूसरा है कि हम पारधी बच्चे हैं, गोंड बच्चे हैं, ओझा कम्युनिटी के बच्चे हैं, बंजर समुदाय के बच्चे, सबकी अलग-अलग भाषा है। तो वो भाषा को हम क्लासरूम में कैसे ला सकते हैं? एक बहुभाषी क्लास को हम कैसे ऑर्गेनाइज़ कर सकते हैं, ताकि हर बच्चे को अपनी भाषा में वहाँ क्लास में बोलने के लिए स्पेस मिल रहा हो, और टीचर्स की तरफ से और बाकी बच्चों की तरफ से भी उतना ही रिस्पेक्ट उसकी भाषा को और उसके अनुभवों को मिल रहा हो। कि बच्चे अगर सड़क पर घूमते हुए उनको कोई नकारात्मक या सकारात्मक जो भी अनुभव हो रहा है, यदि वो अपनी अपने अनुभव लेखन में या कल उसने क्या किया, उस पर अगर कुछ लिखना है, और वो स्पेस वो कल की घटना को, कचरा चुनते समय की घटना को भी यदि वो क्लास के अंदर लेकर आता है, और उस पर एक डायलॉग होता है क्लासरूम के अंदर में, और उस अनुभव को से बाकी बच्चे कुछ सीख रहे होते हैं, तो वो एक स्पेस हो सकता है, एक एफर्ट्स हम लोग फॉलो कर रहे होते हैं। तीसरा है कि कम्युनिटी का इन्वॉल्वमेंट। हम देखें कि हमारी शिक्षा को ऐसा माना गया है कि समुदाय जो है, या खासकर वर्किंग क्लास जो हाशिएग्रस्त समुदाय के लोग हैं, इनका कोई सेंस नहीं है, वो शिक्षा में किसी तरह की कोई भागीदारी उनकी नहीं हो सकती। लेकिन अगर हम देखें तो इन समुदायों के पास बहुत सारा नॉलेज है, ऐसा ट्रेडिशनल नॉलेज है जो बाकी लोगों के पास नहीं है। तो अगर समुदाय को हम इस प्रक्रिया में शामिल करें, सीखने की प्रक्रिया में और करिकुलम डेवलपमेंट की प्रक्रिया में, तो शायद वो उनका इन्वॉल्वमेंट तो बढ़ेगा ही, लेकिन वो बहुत अलग तरह के अनुभव लेकर यहाँ पर इस क्लास में आ रहे होंगे, जो बाकी बच्चों को सीखने के लिए महत्वपूर्ण हो रहा होगा। हम देखते हैं कि बहुत हमारी किताबें बनी हुई है, बहुत अच्छी एनसीईआरटी की बुक्स हैं, और उसमें बहुत स्पष्ट कहा गया है कि ये सिर्फ एक आइडिया है। इस आइडिया को आप अपने एरिया के अनुसार बहुत एक्सप्लोर कर सकते हैं। कि अगर मेरे गाँव का बच्चा और भोपाल शहर का बच्चा, दोनों के अनुभव अलग हो सकते हैं। तो अगर हमें हमें हिल्स के बारे में बताना हो, तो वो मेरे गाँव का बच्चा मेरे गाँव के पास की पहाड़ियों के बारे में सीख रहा होगा, भोपाल शहर का बच्चा शायद भोपाल शहर की पहाड़ियों और तालाब के बारे में सीख रहा होगा। तो वो फ्लेक्सिबिलिटी, वो ओपननेस हमें क्लासरूम में रख रहे होते हैं कि आपके जो अनुभव हैं, बच्चों के जो रियल लाइफ एक्सपीरियंसेस हैं, उसको बेस्ड करते हुए आप नए थ्योरीज, नए कॉन्सेप्ट को सिखा रहे होंगे, तो वो एक बच्चों को बहुत आधार मिल रहा होता है। वो भाषागत कक्षाओं में भी दिखता है, वो मैथ्स की करिकुलम, मैथ्स के अलग-अलग कॉन्सेप्ट सीखने में भी लग रहा होता है। इसके अलावा बच्चे और शिक्षकों के रिश्ते बहुत महत्वपूर्ण होते हैं इस सीखने की प्रक्रिया को, उस जगह को बहुत जीवंत बनाने के लिए। तो टीचर और बच्चों के बीच में एक बहुत ऐसा रिश्ता बिल्ड हो सके जिसमें कि दोनों एक दूसरे के ऊपर भरोसा भी कर रहे हों और वो एक दूसरे के साथ मिलकर सीख रहे हों। शिक्षक सिर्फ देने वाला व्यक्ति नहीं है, वो भी बच्चों से सीख सकता है। ये सोच के साथ अगर शिक्षक वहाँ जा रहे होंगे तो शायद वो एक इंक्लूजन हम देख पाएँगे क्लास के अंदर, स्कूल के अंदर में। तो और बच्चों के जो आपसी रिश्ते हैं कि एक समुदाय का बच्चा है, वो दूसरे समुदाय के बच्चे के साथ उनका इंटरेक्शन उतना नहीं है। लेकिन अगर गोंड बच्चा और पारधी बच्चा मिलकर कोई कॉन्सेप्ट पर काम कर रहे हैं और एक दूसरे की भाषा को सीख रहे हैं और उस एक दूसरे को सिखा रहे हैं, तो वो सीखने की जगह एक अलग तरह से हमें दिखाई देती है, जहाँ पर हर चीज़ से बच्चा सीख रहा हो, एक दूसरे के साथ सीख रहा हो। तो शायद ये इस तरह की कुछ प्रैक्टिसेस हम लोग अपने सेंटर्स पर, हमारे स्कूल्स में कर रहे हैं और वो उसके सकारात्मक परिणाम दिखते हैं कि बच्चे काफ़ी खुश होते हैं और सीखने के लिए तत्पर होते हैं और बहुत रेगुलर क्लास में आ रहे होते हैं। यही बच्चे जब रेगुलर स्कूल में जा रहे होते थे सरकारी स्कूलों से, तो वहाँ से बच्चे साल में 2 साल में ड्रॉप आउट हुए। लेकिन यहाँ बच्चे खुद से आ रहे हैं। अगर बच्चा हमारी जो गाड़ी नहीं जा रही है, बस्ती से वो छूट गया है, तो पैदल चलते हुए स्कूल तक चला आ रहा है। तो इस तरह की चीज़ें हैं जो मैं बोल रहा था पहले भी कि सीखने का स्पेस हमें वो जीवंत बनाने की ज़रूरत होगी। तो शायद हम हर वर्ग के बच्चों को वो क्लासरूम में जगह दे पा रहे होंगे। इस तरह की कुछ प्रैक्टिसेज़ हमें करने की ज़रूरत है अपने स्कूल के अंदर में।
धन्यवाद ब्रजेश जी, काफी सारे मुद्दे उठकर आए हैं। भाषा का मुद्दा है, बच्चों के खुद के वास्तविक अनुभव है उसके बारे में, शिक्षकों का रोल क्या है उसके बारे में। और इसमें एक्चुअली रामदास जी, आई विल कम टू यू बिकॉज आई थिंक working with Adivasi children, I think also in your article you have talked about the role of language and experiences, building on and scaffolding on the experiences of the children. So Ramdas ji, what do you have to say about this?
Yeah, our experience here has been that, all, not only here, but we have also done work in Maharashtra and various other places. We've seen that Adivasi languages are quite different from the vernacular of the state. So this creates, like, Gondi is quite different from, in some ways, Gondi is closer to Tamil than it is to Marathi, So you find a lot of difficulty which children have to be able to get into. So if you look at it, a 6-year-old child entering into a classroom, first of all, for an Adivasi child to enter into the 4 walls, confined space itself is a big problem for them. And once they are inside, then, there's this person who's speaking a completely different language over there. The problem is that none of the teachers really take the trouble to learn local languages. At least in the when a teacher is appointed in a school at the primary level, they should some orientation should be given to them with regard to language. Because without the role of language itself, most teachers don't understand that language and thinking, language and all these things. What is the connection between language and thinking and finding concepts and understanding complex things like maths, and all these things are something that many teachers simply don't understand. So they just think that because you got into this whole thing of rote learning, you just assume that these things are. So in my article also, what we have, I said that the whole attitude, like, a tribal parent never asks a child to go to school, so it's up to the child to go to school or not. So there's tremendous freedom there for the child to, but the school doesn't really keep the child in the school, and we call them dropouts, but they're actually pushed out of schools. So this is a huge problem that we keep facing all the time. So not just the role of language, but also this whole discriminatory attitude that Adivasi people are coming out of the forest. So there's no attempt to train people, to give teachers an orientation as to what it is to work with people like this, and what is it that we can also learn from all these people, because they do have a rich culture. And these are things that we don't seem to appreciate so these are major issues that we face over here. In our school, one of the things that we do is that the day we took Adivasi children, we also took a group of young people from the community, 15 of them, and started training them as teachers. So there are 10 of them who continued with us. They not only have become teachers, but they also became managers of the school, and today they run the school. I don't go to the school anymore. So in the sense that it's only a matter of giving them the opportunity. So when the child comes to the school, there's somebody from the community dealing with them who knows everything about the child. There's no division between the child, the parent, and the teacher. This is a very important thing. This continuum is very important as far as we are concerned. So the whole attitude, the way the child is taught, the way the pedagogy that is used. So we can always bring in a parent or a grandmother, come there to the school, tell stories, sing a song, teach. So all this happens. So this continuum between the village and the home and the school is that there's no break in that, and so the child finds very comfortable there. So we encourage children to speak their language in the school. So we have 4 different tribes here, and all of them speak different languages, and they all speak when they are outside of class there, or sometimes inside of class explaining to each other. They speak their language, and we encourage that. So especially at the primary level, the learning of concepts becomes so important to be able to use that, and the examples that they have and things that they do at home. All these things have become very much an integral part of the whole. So we also teach the history and geography of the community. So we are a movement-based organization. It means we have a whole land rights movement that is built over a period of 10, 20 years. And we have a Sangam. So the history of the Sangam, what happened, all that is part of the school's curriculum, which means that if there is a protest, the teachers also go to the protest. So they are not as though they are separate from the rest of the issues that are happening in the community. So this integral part of the community and the school and the children, this is a very important part of our thing. And because of that, today we have enough respect from the state and from the rest of the community, and they look to us. So in the school, our children are there, and there are other doctors' children and there are people. So now, and other schools have also realized that children who finish from our school and go on to other schools are sometimes far better than many of the children in their own schools. So that has broken the barriers. You know what Brajesh was saying earlier about these various divisions in the thing. This is so important. It's an issue that we need to take up at a later stage. But I think the first step in that whole thing is whether your own children are there in the school. If your children are not there in the school, it's not going to break this thing. And this discrimination also is a barrier that is broken. Just to say, before we came here, we spent 10 years in Pondicherry, and we lived in just soon after my wife, we got married, we moved into a leprosy colony in Pondicherry and lived there for 10 years. And our children went to the school that we started. So this thing of discriminating against people. So, the question of whether somebody sees a deformity in someone is something that you simply remove from your thing. You only look beyond that into the heart of a person. You never see the deformity in a person. So these are all issues that are very important in your own attitudes. And it depends on where you come from in that sense. Yeah, I think I'll stop here.
Thanks, Ramdas. I think this whole idea of school community interlinkages, the way it is framed very often, it's rather the school is embedded in a very critical institution of the community, actually. It's not just in a linkage which is operationalized into, communities bringing children into school, or communities building toilets or tracking children. It's not just that. It is essentially a part and needs to be closely engaged with the pedagogic aspects as well. Yeah, absolutely something that needs to be elaborated on. I actually would like to hear from Chitra now, because I think you also talked about initially, when in your remarks, you talked about bringing different groups together. So what did it take you to make your school inclusive, and what challenges did you encounter?
So I think the first thing that we had, probably the first hurdle, was the parents themselves. Though we keep saying disability is marginalized, I think even among various disability sectors, there is differentiation. And most often, I like what Mr. Ramdas said. Every time I walk up to my parents and say, would your so-called normal sibling start coming, and I am not so ambitious of getting them to come and study in the school, but at least come and spend some time with the other children, so that you can. It took us a couple of years to break that. We had sibling days. We had a program for grandparents, because we thought they were like the biggest hurdle, and the fathers also, to ensure that we created that environment where they all came together. We did this even among all the marginalized groups. It's very easy to just label a particular community and say, no, there is no way that they can accept. In fact, I know parents walking up to me and saying, why are you doing this? So what if, maybe a prisoner's child does not study? How, like India has a large population, where is it going to? Nobody looked at the child and what the child is living through, because some elder in his family has created a crime, right? And it was very interesting, because even for us, I think there were mindsets even among the teaching community that I had to break. It was not easy. It was very nice for the management to say this has to be done. I can't thrust it down unless every single team member feels that, yes, this is important. Right. And I think a lot of times, every time I walk up to a bunch of government school, I'm using government school, even private school teachers, they just say, having such a diverse group in my classroom is more work for me. I don't see why they should be there. I'm, somebody who can only train a bunch of high performing students. So I keep saying, if they are high performing, add one or two of them, you see how much each other would learn. I just want to share this one incident that happened. So there was this child of, again, a prisoner, and he just walked up to us a couple of days later, and then he said, you know why I love this school? Because none of my friends ask me about my dad. Nobody is questioning me about my dad. And that acceptance, today that kid is moved on. He's doing his IIT diploma in engineering, and he's probably going to go to definitely a software company and work. Removing all these barriers, I think, is what an inclusive school is all about. I mean, I think in some cases we seem to be going downhill, because you have one set of elite schools, you have one set of so-called government aided schools. So the population seems to be very divided amongst all this, until probably an IAS officer or somebody like Mr. Ramdas says, my children are going to go to this school, or my children are going to this school. So I guess a lot of it is up to us. Us in the sense of people, the teachers, the teaching fraternity, definitely, for sure. So what if you need to put an extra effort on that one child? So what if one child in your classroom is not getting 100%? So what if that kid is failing? Why don't you take up this kid, and why don't you bring him from maybe 10 marks to 30 marks? And it is not, I keep saying this again and again, it is not always academic performance. In an inclusive school, I think academics really takes the back seat. All that I want to do is to learn social inclusion. All that I want the kids to do is to learn acceptance. And probably if they were all so accepting, their attitudes would have changed, and we would probably not see the kind of things we are seeing every day in terms of religion, in terms of class and caste clashes. I mean, maybe we have failed, but if inclusive schools like ours can set an example, why not? We definitely need more of it. We just don't need it only for the disabled population or only for the marginalized. I now think you need inclusion everywhere. Can we have, like Jo said, I like it when she said the child did not see differences. I'm trying to get transgenders to become caregivers. I'm going to train a group of them. I know there's going to be a lot of resistance, but I think that community also needs to come onto the limelight. They are very compassionate. Can I use that compassion to help our population, which is not getting enough caregivers? Right? So I guess inclusion is something that, like Mr. Ramdas said, needs to start at home. Are we being inclusive enough at home? Which means our institutions, are we taking in all communities into our workforce? Are we okay about a transgender coming and working with our children? Or are we still having this, oh, what is going to happen? Is my child going to be safe with this person? Can we look beyond all that? I think inclusion is that. Let's create this opportunity. It works well and good. It doesn't work, at least we made an attempt and it did work, or it didn't work. Right? And there is space for experimenting. There is space for all of us to change. There is so much space for mistakes to happen and learn from it. And finally, I guess that is all we want to do. We want to give everybody that learning experience. Some kid does learn faster, some kid doesn't learn faster. Why don't we become accommodative? Why should all of us do engineering? Why should all of us do medicine? Why can't one kid just sit and color crayons if that is all he wants to do? And if we can give children this environment where they are free, where there is no pressure, just sitting in front of this so-called Zoom classes, why didn't any of us think of a mother being the teacher? Why should it be something on, didn't my grandmother tell me stories? Why couldn't we had a grandmother to say? And that's all I did during COVID. We never wanted to do therapy online. It blew my mind when somebody said, you could do therapy. And I'm like wondering if that is the case. All of us need to close our shop and go and sit home, right? We can do everything online and show it on a video. So I guess inclusion is all about accommodating each other for whatever you are, thin, fat, black, white, anything. Just be accommodative and inclusion would happen. And openly be accommodative, not because the government is saying so or because you have an agenda or your strategic plan says that in 5 years you need to do it. No, because you really think that is one way where we can move forward. We don't have to wait for the new education policy to say inclusion is compulsory. Let's do it ourselves. Let's do it everywhere, not just in schools. Let's do it in a shopping mall. Let's do it in the beach. Let's do it everywhere. Let's get people of all class and creeds to come together. That's what we are for, right? And this is what I very strongly feel about inclusion.
Thanks, Chitra. I think one of the things that you said really, I hope also Jo will allude to that, is about aims of education and what does inclusive education mean? What are we really trying to achieve when we are saying all children, diverse backgrounds, different abilities coming together? how are we viewing their education? How are we seeing the aims of education for them? Are we looking at it as a universal idea of what all of them must achieve, or are we looking at more child-centered and individually focused idea of what it means for every child, especially children with inclusion? Because even in my prior experience of studying and talking to teachers about inclusion, seeing what it takes to make schools inclusive, I found that teachers look at the idea of education very differently, because it's not just curricular instruction and learning. It is what is extremely important is social education and learning, and even activities of daily living and so on. So I think that's a very important area that needs to be kept in mind when one is trying to make schools inclusive. Jo, what can you tell us about from your experience, what it entails?
I want to go back to the word inclusion. I think it's a funny word, and it kind of implies that there's a group on the inside and they are going to let these outsiders come in. And that power dynamic I find quite disturbing. I feel like if I were one of those kids, I would be like, who are you to include me? I'm already here. I don't need your permission to walk in the door. And I think that when we start to look at it from that perspective, that typical children are also included. Everybody is in the room together. And that if you just think about those disadvantaged, so-called disadvantaged children as being the ones that we are graciously allowing in, you miss out on all the things that Ramji and Chitra and Brajesh are talking about. What they bring is really quite remarkable. And if you think about those typical kids, the problems that they have, the things that they need to work on and learn to do differently. Like, why is bullying such a problem in every single school in this country, in this world? Bullying is, it's an epidemic. And these are children who have so-called advantages. These are kids who come from good families, who have adequate income, who may be smart, but they seem to have to bully other children. And particularly when we bring these disadvantaged kids into the school, you see an increase in that because they find a target. They find kids that they can really prey on. Now, I see that as a real problem of those children. Those children need to be supported. They need to be helped to come up to the level that many of our kids are already at, of acceptance, of tolerance, of understanding. So it's not a one-way street that, you know, we bring these children in and they get the benefit of being with the typical kids. Often the typical kids are the problem. So I think we have to stop putting them in categories at all and just bring them together and see how we can make that learning environment happen so that every child is learning in the way that works for them. And every child gets the chance to bring what they know, what their experiences have taught them to the other kids, so that it's really a shared experience, an exchange of knowledge and language and traditions that are so different according to your family, your abilities, your understanding. I mean, I have seen so many wonderful things happen with children being taught by so-called disabled kids, the kinds of things that they learn from these children that they never expected to. They come in, we get kids who come in from mainstream schools to work with our kids, and they think they're the ones doing them a favor, and it actually turns out to be the opposite. I think when we think about inclusive education, where the disabled child or the disadvantaged child, they come into the school kind of holding up a mirror, and they expose all of the gaps that exist in our system. And then we turn around and we blame the child. We say, you don't know the language, or you don't know how to sit straight. You don't know how to learn the stuff that I'm teaching you. But in fact, they're holding up the mirror to us and showing us where we have got to change, where we have to adapt our system and make it work so that it works for them as well. And, you think about the things that people bring up typically are, we don't have enough trained teachers. We don't have a curriculum that works for these kids. We don't have the physical accessibility. But that's what they're there to show us how to correct. The trained teachers are not the answer to everything. And what ends up happening in a lot of inclusive schools, I notice my friend Ina is here in the audience, and she works in a mainstream school as a special educator. And one of the things she said is that often when the kids go in for the music class or the art class, the art teacher or the music teacher expects the special educator to stay there because those are your kids. You have to take care of them. I'll do the art class, but you have to make sure it works for them. And that is like the exact opposite of what we're trying to achieve, where we're bringing these kids in to be part of something with the art teacher. It's not the special educator's job to navigate it for them. That is everybody's job. And the problem with those resource rooms within mainstream schools that we think are the answer, that solves everything, is that it remains as exclusive as ever. You are not really part of this group, except for those subjects that don't matter: music, drama, dance, PE. And even then, we want the special educators or the therapists to be there to make it happen. What we really need to start looking at is how every teacher begins to understand their role and becomes a special educator. It's really that's the answer, that everybody sees supporting children as their job, regardless of what kind of support that kid needs. And you cannot prepare a school for everything. You cannot say, we'll train you in visual disabilities, we'll train you in hearing handicap, we'll train you in intellectual impairment. What you have to give them is the attitude that I am a teacher, that means I'm a problem solver. If a kid is in my class who has a problem with vision, I figure it out. I find out what that kid needs and I adapt the lessons. And then in the process, I discover that there are lots of other kids who have a visual handicap, maybe not as severe as a blind child or a child with really low vision, but 30% of any school body has got a vision problem. And you just look around us, you're wearing glasses, Archana, Chitra's wearing glasses, I'm wearing glasses. Other people here may be wearing contacts, who knows, or they use them occasionally. But 30% of the children in a government school need some kind of corrective lenses, and they don't have them because of the stigma, because they think they can't afford them. And when you bring a blind child into a mainstream classroom and suddenly you are teaching differently to accommodate that child, you automatically are making the system work better for those 30% that you didn't even know were there. And the same is true with hearing handicaps, that you bring a deaf child in, you start to teach differently, and suddenly you find other children are paying better attention because now the teacher realizes, I have to work with this kid. And in doing that, we always say this at the Latika Roy Foundation, plan for the most vulnerable and you make the system work better for everybody. And I've seen it come true again and again. When we accommodate for a kid with a physical disability, we make everything work better for all of the children. When we understand that children with intellectual impairment learn best through activity, every kid has a better day because everybody learns better through activities. When we get a new phone, how many of us read the instruction manual? I don't think any of us do. We start playing with it, right? Because that's how we learn. That's how our brains work, actually through doing it. And when we allow children the pleasure of learning through doing, because the intellectually impaired child only learns that way, suddenly all the kids are doing better. That's the Maria Montessori method. And she learned it from disabled children. That's what she started out doing. And she knew that those kids would learn better through activities. So she started using that as a method to teach any child. And that's what I mean, that we bring these kids in thinking we're doing them the favor, but we have so much to learn from them. And it's not just true for disabled kids, it's true for the tribal kids whose understanding of how the ecosystem of their forests work is so much more evolved than our own. We live in cities, we have no idea what the natural environment is like anymore. We've lost it. These kids have a chance of reawakening it in us. That whole thing that Ram was saying about generations coming together to take care of the child, and that thing that you wrote in your article, Ram, which I loved about, it's such a strange thing to take a child out of their home and put them in a school with only kids of the same age. Where did that come from? No family sets up like that. There's elderly people, there are babies, there are teenagers, there are young people. It's really like such an artificial environment that we have created in school. And when we bring all our disabled, so-called disadvantaged kids in, we can resurrect that knowledge that's still within us, and we can come back to it and change this bizarre environment we have forced our kids into. And that's why they're all bullying each other, because they're trying to resist it.
Thanks so much, Jo. This has been such a fascinating, session, listening so far to all of you. And I think we have about 100+ participants who are also, I think, shooting out questions in the Q&A. So I want to leave enough time for that. But before we go, I want to ask all of you, if you could share one important thing that needs to be done to support inclusive education at local level. Just one thing, each one of you, if you could just flag out, I think that would be really valuable for all of us. So who would like to go? Just one most important change that needs to happen to support inclusion or to make inclusion happen. Ramdas?
Since I was talking about this whole question of culture, something that has to start from the top, I think it's very important that people who run schools, because we are always talking about training teachers, we are always giving input to teachers, we are never giving anything to people who run schools. They are industrialists, or they are businessmen, or they are this or that, but we never really get to them. And I think somewhere, either from government side or whatever thing, something to bring people like that together to actually sit down and say, what do they think is the problem? Why is it that they don't want to do something? Or what is the, of course, we are a very exam-centric system here, and the competition, like Jo was saying, who wants, Chitra was saying, we don't want to, our grades will come down if we have to spend time and all that. But in spite of that, is there something that they would, I think if we did appeal to people, there might be somewhere we could also break this whole thing. Because the thing is that if you take any school, at least 20% of the children in a school have learning difficulties of one kind or the other. They are dyslexic, there's this, that, something or the other. And somehow we seem to simply brush them aside. So just to tell them that, these are issues that are there before you, can we do something? Some attempt to bring people like that together, I think would be I would suggest. Yeah.
Thanks, Ramdas. Brajesh, एक कोई आपका recommendation हो या क्या change के लिए क्या करना आवश्यक हो? म्यूट पर है आप शायद, ब्रजेश जी।
मुझे लगता है कि क्या रिकमेंडेशन हो सकते हैं, एक सवाल भी इस क्वेश्चन आंसर वाले में डला हुआ है कि क्या कॉमन स्कूल सिस्टम एक व्यवस्था हो सकती है और सारे प्राइवेट स्कूलों को बंद कर दिया जाए, ये सॉल्यूशन हो सकता है। पर मुझे लगता है कि अगर हम हर वर्ग के प्रतिनिधित्व की बात करते हैं तो हमें उस तरफ वो एक डिफिकल्ट चीज है, लेकिन कॉमन स्कूल सिस्टम एक सॉल्यूशन हो सकता है कि जहाँ पर हर वर्ग के बच्चे और हर वर्ग का प्रतिनिधित्व हो रहा होगा। खतरा स्कूल किताब आप देखेंगे विनोद रायना जी की है, इसमें वो बहुत स्पष्ट बताते हैं कि और दिखता भी है कि आज सरकारी स्कूलों में मोस्टली हम देखें तो वर्किंग जो बच्चे एकदम हाशिए पर जो समुदाय है वही बच्चे वहां पर पढ़ाई कर रहे हैं। और फिर वहाँ जो इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर से वहाँ जिस तरह टीचर्स का क्वालिटी है वो बहुत लो स्टैंडर्ड का हमें दिखाई देता है। सरकारी स्कूलों में जाकर काम करने के एक्सपीरियंसेस हैं, और मतलब सरकारी स्कूल के टीचर्स पर मैं आक्षेप नहीं लगा रहा हूँ, लेकिन जो पॉलिसीज सरकार के द्वारा बनाई गई हैं कि अनट्रेन्ड टीचर्स को भी वहां पर रिक्रूट कर किया जा रहा है या उनको तो हमें जो रामदास जी कह रहे थे वो एक इश्यूज भी है कि हमें समुदाय के भाषा और वहाँ के ऐसे लोगों की भी जरूरत है जो बच्चों की भाषा को जान रहे हो, बच्चों के कल्चर को जान रहे हो, जो क्लास को इंक्लूसिव बनाने में बहुत मददगार हो सकता है। लेकिन वहाँ उस दौर में जगह पर वहाँ शिक्षकों की क्वालिफिकेशन को भी एक स्पेस के तौर पर देखा जाना चाहिए, कितने खुलेपन से वो चीजों को एक्सेप्ट कर रहे हैं, क्योंकि एक जिस तरीकों से हम सीखते हुए आए हैं वो तरीके भी हम स्कूलों में जो ट्रेडिशनल तरीके से सीखे हैं वो मतलब एज ए स्कूलों में टीचर्स की ट्रेनिंग के दौरान के अनुभव है कि लोग उन चीजों को तोड़ना ही नहीं चाहते हैं। नहीं, ये सीखने का तो यही तरीका है जिससे हम सीख कर आए हुए हैं, तो वो फ्लेक्सिबिलिटी दरअसल खो जाती है। और वो जो बात हो रही हर बच्चा कुछ इंडिविजुअल है, अलग अलग तरीके से सीख रहा होता है, तो वो बात अगर क्लास में आ रही होगी तो उसको समझ के साथ जाने के लिए भी शिक्षकों को भी इतना ओपननेस के साथ जाने की जरूरत है। तो ये 2-3 चीजें मुझे लग रहा है कि बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट हैं मेरे नजरिए से, कि जिनको हमें शामिल करनी चाहिए रिकमेंडेशन के तौर पर।
धन्यवाद ब्रजेश जी। चित्रा।
So I very strongly feel that, inclusive schools can't be standalones. It needs to be part of the entire ecosystem. You need to stop differentiating right at birth, and then, ensure that it all, like, I love what Jo said. You can't create differences and then try and bring us together. That is never going to happen. If you don't see the differences right from day one and ensure that everything is the same for everybody, then there's no question of creative, special, inclusive schools. When everything around you is being excluded, and this is only for this particular community or this particular social sector, and then we are a bunch of us trying to say include us into the system, or like Jo said, there's nothing to include. You pull them into your system, which is very, very true, and that's sometimes I give up and I say, who the hell are you to include me? I mean, I can live my life. Literally, I literally say that. So I think we can't just look at schooling and education and say, include us. Start including us in everything. Schools will follow suit, literally. You create differences and then talk about inclusion will never happen. So I think the DNA should change there. At birth, before birth, when you're getting married, like the entire ecosystem has to break, has to change. And then, okay, schools will follow. But you can't just create a couple of inclusive schools and say, I'm an inclusive society. You're not. Because I still can't take my kids on to a bus. I am stared at. The kids are stared at. Right? Though I say, then I just go travel in my own bus with my own wheelchair accessible facilities and still say, oh, I've included a bunch of children into schools. That's telling ourselves a big lie, and that's what we are all trying to do. So if we can just try and see if I can change people, have conversations on inclusion, say why this is important. Why are we only focusing on what is good? Let's focus on what the child cannot do. So what? So what if my child can't walk the same way that you and I walk? Why can't I accept that difference? And if I do that, then there's no conversation for inclusion. It happens. Everybody then sits in the classroom. Why do I get labeled as intelligent? Why do I get labeled as not intelligent? I think I learn, or all the teachers learn so much more from a child who is, marginalized, rather than probably going to a mainstream school and trying to tell these kids, don't get addicted to your cell phones and please listen to me in the classroom. It can be painful to be a teacher there. It's probably far more satisfying to be training a bunch of these kids. So I think it all has to start and have conversations everywhere. As common as having it on your dining table. Talk to your kids. Why should it be just selective populations? People like me and Ramdas and Jo talk to our kids. Everybody should talk about it, unless we get the children to start hearing this word. Then suddenly they'll say, what is this inclusion? Simply because they also then start, understanding this. Let's not make this very elitist. And, just a few of us. No, it has to become regular conversations everywhere. Then we will probably achieve for the population that we are looking at, unless we make it so-called mainstream discussions and topics, not one education policy, but all the states' education policy. Every single minister saying the same thing, every single NGO talking about the same thing. Then I guess we will reach somewhere. Otherwise, there'll still be pockets of ours who are achieving or trying to pull each other's hair and do the best of what is available, right? And I think it's time to move on. I mean, to get youngsters into it, to get people. Every time I ask a bunch of youngsters, how many of you have seen people with disabilities? I mean, very few hands get raised. Why should it be that even today? Why should we learn about disability only from a movie or maybe from, a blockbuster? Why can't we do it by somebody who is living right next to us, who has that need, right? And then we could talk about inclusion like common word. It has to be made common jargon. It can't be just on workshops like this. It has to become mainstream.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Chitra. Jo?
एक चीज चुनना बहुत मुश्किल है, तो मैं कुछ पीछे से करूँगी. I'm going to answer one of the questions कि हमारे Q&A में ट्रेनिंग कैसे करते हैं अपने संस्था में, ताकि अपने स्टाफ को एक्सेप्ट करते हैं ये नई आइडियाज है इंक्लूजन के बारे में. तो लतिका रॉय फाउंडेशन में हमारा विजन है कि प्रत्येक अनमोल, और उसी सोच से हमारा ऑर्गेनाइजेशन में सबको रिस्पेक्ट देते हैं, जैसे भी हो. अगर ड्राइवर है या गेटकीपर है या पेरेंट है या डॉक्टर है, सब लोग एक जैसे ट्रीट करते हैं. और ये एकदम फाउंडेशन ऊपर से नीचे तक वही तरीका है. तो मुझे लगता है कि हमारा छोटे छोटे चीजों से, जैसे चित्र कह रही है कि how do we treat each other, and what Ram was saying also कि हमारे अपने foundations में, अपने centers में, are we walking the talk? Are we actually living the inclusion that we preach to other people? और मैं अभी हिंदी में बात कर रही हूँ क्योंकि मुझे पता है कि राजेश is the only one कि हिंदी में बात कर रही हैं, और मैं भी हिंदी बहुत मुश्किल है मेरे लिए, लेकिन फिर भी कोशिश करती हूँ क्योंकि उसी से इंक्लूजन भी होते हैं कि और लोग हैं इस ऑडियंस में जिनको सिर्फ हिंदी आती है या हिंदी प्रेफर करते हैं. तो हम भी वो थोड़ा और एक्स्ट्रा कोशिश करना है ताकि हम और लोगों को एम्ब्रेस करते हैं, और हमारा वल्नरेबिलिटी भी शो करना है. हमारी हिंदी आप दोनों हंस रही है और बाकी लोग नहीं देख सकते हैं, लेकिन मेरे ख्याल से वो भी हंस रही है. हमारी हिंदी ऐसे ही है, लेकिन कोई बात नहीं. इसी तरह से हम लोगों को और रीच आउट करते हैं. और I think if we can live it in our own lives. मैंने हिंदू के साथ शादी किया, मैं कैथलिक हूँ, कोई बात नहीं, उसी से भी इंक्लूजन होते हैं. और हमारे बच्चे लोग अलग अलग logo ke saath, Catholic. Kathleen is Catholic. She's married a Jew. Anand is from India. He's married a girl from China. So हमारी family में भी examples होते हैं और हमारे संस्था भी होते हैं और छोटे छोटे कदम से हम बहुत बड़ा बदलाव ला सकते हैं. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jo, and thanks for also responding to one of the questions here, training के बारे में, and pointing out the importance of taking small steps. We have time for one more question which we can take, and maybe actually there are two questions here from Nageshwari Ramaswamy and Divya Subramaniam. Nageshwari asks, in the present scenario, inclusion means simply sitting in one place or in a classroom, and that is obviously not enough. So how can we overcome such situations? And Divya asks, do you think we could move closer towards inclusion if we removed all private schools? जैसे ब्रजेश जी भी कह रहे थे, common school system, तो क्या अगर हम सारे प्राइवेट स्कूल्स निकाल दे सकते हैं, तो क्या और सिर्फ पब्लिक स्कूल एजुकेशन, गवर्नमेंट स्कूल सारे लोगों पर अगर मैंडेट किया जाए, तो क्या हम इंक्लूजन की तरफ पहुंच सकते हैं? तो कोई भी आप में से क्विक रिस्पॉन्स, बिकॉज आई नो वी आर अप टू टाइम ऑलरेडी, तो एनीबडी हु वुड लाइक टू टेक अ शॉट एट दिस? हाँ, ब्रजेश जी. सविता जी, आप भी अगर कुछ जोड़ना चाहती है तो.
मतलब ये जो दो सवाल हैं, सॉरी, कि कॉमन स्कूल सिस्टम लाने से सोसाइटी में क्या बदलेगा, इंक्लूजन कितना होगा, शायद उस पर हम जजमेंटल नहीं हो सकते हैं कि सिचुएशन क्या बनेगी. सोसाइटी में बहुत अलग अलग जगहों से लोग सीख रहे होते हैं, लोग बहुत अलग अलग अनुभवों से सीख रहे होते हैं. अपने परिवारों में जो बात आ रही है कि हमें अपने परिवारों से शुरू करनी पड़ेगी, लेकिन स्कूल, मेरा कहने का मतलब स्कूल एक बड़ा रोल अदा करता है इस जो समाज के अंदर गैर बराबरी हम देखते हैं, तो वो काफी हद तक चीजें कम हो रही होंगी, लेकिन उसके लिए बहुत अलग अलग तरह से काम करने की जरूरत होगी. सिर्फ स्कूल बंद कर देने से सब चीजें एक प्लेटफॉर्म पर जाएंगी, शायद संभव नहीं है, लेकिन एक एफर्ट बहुत जरूरी है कि हम उस दिशा में सोचें. अगर दूसरा है कि एक कमरे में बैठने से ही शायद इंक्लूजन आ जाएगा, वो संभव नहीं है. जो क्लासरूम के अंदर जो चीजें घटित हो रही हैं, या जो टीचिंग मेथड्स चल रही हैं, उसमें कितना बच्चों का इन्वॉल्वमेंट है, बच्चों को कितना स्पेस दिया जा रहा है, वो बहुत महत्वपूर्ण है. एक दूसरे से सीखना बहुत जरूरी होता है. बच्चे, और बहुत अच्छे से बच्चे, हमारी क्लास में मुझे गोंडी नहीं आती है, लेकिन जब कोई कॉन्सेप्ट या सोशल स्टडी का कोई चैप्टर या कोई फ्रेज बच्चों को समझ नहीं आ रहा होता है, तो गोंडी बच्चा जो समझ रहा है, वो अपने साथियों को सिखा रहा होता है. तो इस तरह का इन्वॉल्वमेंट बहुत जरूरी होगा कि वो उनका पार्टिसिपेशन हो उस पूरे सीखने की प्रक्रिया में, और वो टीचर्स के एंड पर भी हो कि टीचर, मतलब जो पहले भी मैंने कहा कि शिक्षक वो मतलब हम बच्चों से भी सीख रहे होते हैं. मुझे अगर बाइलिंगुअल मल्टीलिंगुअल क्लास चलानी है और वहां पर मेरी माँ बहुत काम करती है, जैसे मुझे गोंडी में लिखना है, मुझे नहीं आता है, तो बच्चा मुझे बता रहा होता है कि इसको ये लिखना है, तो वो प्रोसेस में बच्चे की इन्वॉल्वमेंट, बच्चे की भागीदारी बहुत हद तक बढ़ जाती है, और वो जो कॉन्फिडेंस बच्चे को आता है कि अरे मैं इस प्रक्रिया में शामिल हो सकता हूँ, वही समुदाय का है. कि समुदाय की पार्टिसिपेशन के हम भी इस सीखने की प्रक्रिया में, बच्चों की शिक्षा में भागीदार हो सकते हैं, हमारा पार्टिसिपेशन भी हो सकता है. तो वो ये चीजें शायद, और हमें उस दिशा की ओर धीरे धीरे जो कदम बढ़ेंगे, शायद वो हमें करने की जरूरत होगी. और हर एंड पर, हर जगह पर शायद जो बात आ रही है कि घरों में क्या क्या होता है, घरों में हम क्या स्पेस दे रहे हैं, कि हमारे घर के बाजू में कोई जैसे अभी एक हम लोग क्लासेस चला रहे हैं बस्ती सेंटर्स पर. अब हम क्लास ले रहे हैं कि हमें डिसेबल्ड बच्चे के साथ किस तरह से ट्रीट करना है, और बच्चे वहां बैठकर अपनी बात कर रहे हैं, लेकिन बस्ती में ही एक बच्चा है जो डिसेबल्ड है, जो सेंटर तक नहीं आ पा रहा है. तो मसला बनता है कि हम अपने बच्चों के साथ सेंटर लेकर क्या वहां जाएं, बच्चे के पास जाएं, और फिर एफर्ट्स वो हुई कि बच्चे गए, टीचर भी गए बस्ती में, और उस बच्चे से डायलॉग हुआ, बातचीत हुई, और फिर वो बच्चे तब बच्चे शायद रियल समझ पाएंगे कि सेंसिटिविटी की हम बात कर रहे हैं कि बच्चे सेंसिटिव हो टूवर्ड्स द डिसेबल्ड बच्चे, स्पेशल नीड बच्चे की तरह, लेकिन हमारे बस्ती के अंदर जो बच्चे डिसेबल्ड हैं उनसे हमारा डायलॉग कितना हो पा रहा है, वो स्पेस क्रिएट करने की जरूरत होगी, तो शायद वो इंक्लूजन को हम लेकर आता है। सॉरी इतना।
थैंक्स ब्रजेश जी, आपने काफी व्यापक उत्तर दिया है। और कोई जोड़ना चाहता है क्विकली, इफ देयर इज एनीथिंग, और एल्स वी विल जस्ट मेक सम concluding observations before handing it to Supriya. Anybody, Jo, Ramdas, Chitra, any quick response? Yes, Ramdas.
I just want to say I've been very uncomfortable with this word inclusion, which Jo also mentioned, because it gives a completely different perspective to the issue that we are facing. We are talking about equality in that space, which is the school or whatever, and it's not a question of someone including somebody. That power game step comes into play over there, then that really sort of affects the whole atmosphere. So this is something that we need to keep in mind. Using of that word itself, we avoid using that word inclusion anywhere. We are talking about equal opportunity for everybody under the sun.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ramdas, and thank you all of you as well as participants for pointing some of these very crucial aspects which allowed our panelists to expand on it further. I'm not even trying to summarize this rich discussion, but just want to share with you some of my thoughts very quickly. And taking away from the key conclusion which Ramdas actually brought about towards the end right now, the whole idea of inclusion itself, we could perhaps call it positive learning environments. And in order to bring about these positive learning environments, I think it will really require an extensive exercise of education planning, which pays attention to not only infrastructure, but also curricula, teacher preparation, who can teach, what they should learn, how can we measure what is learned. And it will also require tapping into expertise that lie outside the school system, especially special schools, resource centers, communities, parents, persons with disabilities, organizations comprising of persons with disabilities. So I think that is one major takeaway for me. The second one I would think is that we talked about various groups and, we talked about different categories and diversities, but it's important to not look at these conditions, in my view, as conditions or positions in silos. We need to really, because that itself becomes an exclusionary process. And it is important to focus on multiple disadvantages, the intersectionalities, and to really talk about providing equitable opportunities for effective participation. The third one is with regards to the aims. And I think for me, this is one of the crucial areas where we need to really reflect, because can you really uniformly prescribe this? Can the compulsions that are currently imposing on us in terms of competency-based learning, in terms of learning outcome-focused conceptions of aims of education, can we really, can this really work in an inclusive or a positive learning environment that we are trying to create? And can we not go back to what RT talked about in terms of curricular principles of all-round development of children, building on children's potential and developing both the physical as well as mental abilities to the fullest? And finally, actually, after having heard the panelists, I think what lies for me at the core of such practices is the need for our education systems and school practices to respect every child and treat every child coming into the school with dignity, acknowledge their uniqueness, celebrate their differences and the diversity among learners, and not push them under the carpet for convenience or for completing check boxes and so on. And this will actually require us to look at inclusive societies, not as a separate additional goal to be achieved, but integral to the part of the education itself. I really think these are conversations that most of us are engaged with and would like to continue with each other. And thanks Wipro Foundation for providing this space today. I also think they have a short online feedback poll that they may flash up. So those of you who are still here, please take a moment to give us your valuable feedback. And I'm sure that will help the organizers and all of us to learn from this experience. Over to you, Supriya.
थैंक्स अर्चना. इतने सारे महत्वपूर्ण मुद्दों के ऊपर चर्चा करने के लिए आप सबको धन्यवाद. This is my 2 bits at Hindi as well. I'm not very comfortable, unfortunately, in Hindi either. But such powerful aspects that were brought to the fore, such thought-provoking aspects that were brought up by all the speakers and panelists. So a big thank you from on behalf of Wipro Foundation to all of you and the participants as well for all the questions that were put up by them. For those of you who are wondering कि जो articles शायद कुछ speakers ने refer किए थे वो हमारी latest issue of सामूहिक पहल में है. I think we'll share that in the chat link as well. So we are hoping that we can have more such conversations with all of you, and sincerely think that all of us will take back the points that have come in the discussions and will be perhaps able to do something about it. So thank you all. Have a good evening.